I shouldn't have been at the storage yard that morning, standing ankle-deep in dust, while my sister-in-law Patricia tossed a fireproof lockbox into a dumpster like it was a broken toaster, because that lockbox would eventually put her in federal prison and hand me the keys to a $500,000 business she was about to steal. But I didn't know that yet. I didn't know that my late husband David had spent his final months building a trap so perfect she would walk right into it with a ballpoint pen and a forged notary stamp. All I knew that day was that the ground still felt soft over David's grave and Patricia was already redecorating his office in her head. My name is Marie, but you don't need to know much else. I'm 47 years old, and I spent 23 of those years married to a man named David Hartman. Together, we built Hartford Storage from a patch of gravel and a single 12-unit building into the biggest family-owned storage facility in 3 counties. He handled the heavy lifting, the roll-up doors, the roof patches, the temperamental forklift, and I handled the books. Every invoice, every tax filing, every quarterly estimate tabbed and color-coded by hand in a ledger system I designed myself. The business was our 3rd child, we used to say, because we didn't have kids of our own. That made the betrayal sting even harder when it came. Patricia, my sister-in-law, had moved back 2 years ago with her husband Richard. She was David's younger sister, and she had spent most of her adult life failing upward in Scottsdale. When they pulled into our gravel lot in leased German SUVs with ideas about our branding and our customer experience and our market positioning, David just smiled at me and said, "She's my sister. I've got no choice. You, I chose." That was the last time I heard him speak without strain in his voice. 3 months later, while he was adjusting a tension spring on Unit 47, his heart stopped. By the time I ran out to the yard with a bottle of water, he was already gone. The funeral was on a Wednesday. Patricia wore a black suit that cost more than the casket, and she cried just enough to look appropriate in the photos Richard kept snapping with his phone. I remember standing in the reception line and noticing that Richard's phone camera was angled not at Patricia, but at the condolence book, where names of business contacts were being written. He was cataloging every handshake, every business card left on the table. When I caught his eye, he smiled with all the warmth of a lizard on a rock. On Friday morning, less than 48 hours after we put David in the ground, Patricia showed up at the office with a clipboard and announced she was taking point on the transition. She said I was clearly too distraught to handle business matters and that she was only trying to help. I was still in a fog of grief, so I didn't argue. I sat in the corner chair and watched her start pulling things off shelves. She made a whole production of it. Honestly, Marie, half this stuff is obsolete. You've got manuals for software that doesn't even exist anymore. Look at this binder, handwritten rent rolls from 1998. Who needs that? She held up a gray lockbox about the size of a shoebox, with the word scrap metal scrawled across the top in David's handwriting. The label had always confused me, but I never asked about it. What even is this? Old parts? She didn't open it. She didn't shake it. She just heaved it into the dumpster behind the office, a heavy steel bin that smelled of stale coffee grounds and old motor oil. I heard it clang against the metal floor, and she dusted off her hands and moved on to the next shelf, while Richard nodded from the doorway like a man whose only job was to agree. I waited until they left for a strategy lunch at the country club, then I walked out to that dumpster. My hands were shaking, not from grief, but from a deep, cold intuition I couldn't name yet. I pulled an old wooden crate over, climbed up, and leaned in. The box was wedged between a bag of trash and a broken office chair. I hauled it out, wiping coffee grounds off the lid, and carried it back to the office. It had a combination lock built into the front. I tried the date we met, the date we married, the day we closed on the land for the first unit. None of it worked. Then I remembered. 829, our anniversary, the same 3 numbers David used for everything from his gym locker to his phone passcode. The lock clicked open. Inside, there were no scrap metal parts. There was a stack of original stock certificates for Hartford Storage Corp., 50 shares issued to my name, embossed with the corporate seal and dated the year we incorporated. And there was a sealed envelope with my name in David's handwriting. I tore it open right there, my fingers still greasy from the dumpster rim, and I read the only words that would matter for the next 18 months. Marie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Do not trust Patricia. She tried to push me into selling the business 2 years ago and I refused. She has a plan. I've taken steps to protect you, but you have to be smart and you have to be quiet. The law firm of Miller and Crane has sealed instructions. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. Wait for them to contact you. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I love you. I read it 5 times. I sat on the floor of my own office, surrounded by the wreckage of Patricia's cleaning spree, and I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not because I was sad, although I was, but because the man I married had seen this coming and had spent his last months building a fortress around me that I hadn't even known existed. He was the quiet architect, and his final work was a blueprint for my survival. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family shouldn't steal from family. Now, let me tell you how I went from dumpster diving widow to sole owner of a business that now pays for an entire scholarship fund. The manipulation started gently, the way most traps do. Patricia sat me down 2 days later with a cup of herbal tea and a voice so soft it made my teeth ache. She said she was worried about me, that the main house was full of too many memories, that I'd sleep better in their guest house, the one with heated floors and monogrammed towels and a view of the garden. She said it would be temporary, just until I got my feet back under me. I knew exactly what she meant. She wanted me away from the business office, away from the bank contacts, and somewhere she could monitor every phone call I made. The guest house was a detached 1-bedroom unit behind the main house, connected by a covered breezeway and a laundry room door that she assured me I could bolt from my side for privacy. I saw the lock on that door was on her side, not mine, so the promise was hollow. I packed a single suitcase, a bag of toiletries, and I made sure my lockpick set was rolled inside a pair of wool socks at the bottom. Before David, before the storage business, before I became a respectable small business owner who chaired the Chamber of Commerce Welcoming Committee, I was a locksmith's apprentice in Baton Rouge. My uncle ran a 24-hour emergency lockout service, and from the age of 16, I could rake a quickset deadbolt faster than most people could find their keys. I knew pin and tumbler theory. I could decode a tubular lock, and I had spent enough weekends rekeying storage units for tenants who lost their padlock keys that I kept a small set of Peterson picks in my glove compartment out of habit. No one in my new life knew I could do it, and Patricia certainly didn't suspect that the foggy, grieving widow she'd installed in her guest house had a tension wrench and a half-diamond pick tucked into a makeup bag. I remembered Uncle Roy's voice in my head. A lock is just a puzzle with a deadline, Marie. Stay calm, feel the binding pin, and never force it. That advice would become my mantra in the months ahead. I played my role perfectly. I shuffled when I walked. I stared out windows without focusing on anything. I let my coffee go cold, and I nodded whenever Patricia patted my hand and said things like, "We just want what David would have wanted." She'd bring me dinner on a tray, some bland chicken breast or a salad I wouldn't eat, and I'd push it around while she sat on the edge of the bed and talked about how the business needed fresh leadership, and how Richard had a background in asset management that could really stabilize things. I noticed she never mentioned numbers, never mentioned shares or percentages or any legal specifics. She was feeling me out, testing to see if I understood what I owned. So I answered her questions with vague, soft words, never quite meeting her eyes. It was exhausting, but it worked. She thought I was broken. Richard, meanwhile, was always on the phone. I'd see him through the guest house window, pacing the back patio with a Bluetooth headset, his voice dropping to a whisper whenever I came into view. I started keeping a small notebook hidden under my mattress. In the first week, I logged 17 separate calls that ended abruptly when I entered a room. I began taking careful notes. Timestamps, the few words I caught, the rhythm of the conversations. I'd walk outside to get some air and slow down by the French doors that led to his study, pretending to admire the roses while listening to fragments like, "The note is callable. They're pushing for acceleration, and we need that signature before the quarter ends." One evening, I heard him say, "If we can't get control by Tuesday, they'll file a lien." Then there was a pause, and he added, "No, she doesn't know anything. She's a ghost." The mail delivered to their house was another crack in the facade. Patricia had set up a forwarding address for business mail, claiming it would reduce confusion. I started waking up early, before their housekeeper arrived, to check the mailbox by the front gate before Patricia could intercept it. Among the catalogs and junk mail, there were statements from a credit union in Mesa, a commercial bank in Phoenix, and a high-interest online lender I'd never heard of. All of them were addressed to Patricia and Richard personally. Patricia had said it was client portfolios because she'd been a financial advisor before she decided being a kept wife was less work. But the red ink on those envelopes told a different story. I began to understand that the debts circling this house were not client portfolios. They were desperation with a logo. One night, I retrieved the shredded documents, and this was where my old bookkeeping discipline paid off in a way I never expected. I'd noticed that Richard took out the trash every Tuesday evening, and in the recycling bin alongside the wine bottles was a clear bag of cross-cut shredder confetti. Tuesday was chosen because it was the night before trash collection, so I had maybe 8 hours before it would be gone. I waited until midnight, when the sensor lights on the patio had been off for 3 hours and the dog was asleep inside their house. I crept out with a flashlight, my feet in thick wool socks to muffle sound on the flagstones. The recycling bin was at the side of the garage, and I lifted the lid slowly, cringing at the slight creak of plastic. Inside, the bag was light, mostly shredded paper with a few envelopes. I retrieved 2 handfuls of the shreds, stuffed them into a Ziploc bag I had tucked into my waistband, and returned to the guest house. Back at my kitchenette table, I spread a clean white sheet across the surface to make the shreds visible and began the tedious work of sorting them by color and font. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I figured anything they went to the trouble of shredding was worth piecing back together. The cross-cut pattern made it a jigsaw with 1,000 tiny rectangles, but I'd done similar work years ago reconciling torn deposit slips from a jammed office shredder, so I was patient. Over 3 hours, I used tweezers and clear tape, handling each piece like evidence. Slowly, words emerged. Past due, balance owing, notice of default. By dawn, I had reassembled enough to read a past due notice from a credit card company with a balance of $42,000, a collection agency letter referencing a defaulted personal loan of $85,000, and a note from a bank reminding Richard that his home equity line of credit was in default and subject to foreclosure. The last one had a date stamp from 10 days before David died. I photographed everything and stored the taped-together documents in a manila envelope I hid behind the guest house's loose baseboard. The vultures weren't circling just me. They were circling their own house, and my business was the only life raft they could see. The sink leak gave me my first opportunity to show just enough competence to stay useful without revealing anything. The guest house bathroom had a slow drip, a constant tap, tap, tap that I could hear at night, and I saw the water stain spreading on the ceiling of the room below. Patricia offered to call a plumber, but I told her not to waste the money. She gave me a look I can only describe as puzzled contempt, as if the idea that I might know which end of a wrench to hold was somehow offensive. I went to the garage where David's truck was still parked, fetched his toolbox, and came back. Under the sink, I shut off the shut-off valve, unscrewed the compression nut on the supply line, and immediately saw the problem. The rubber O-ring had perished and was crumbling into black crumbs. I cleaned the seat with a rag, popped in a new O-ring from David's spare parts bin, put everything back together, and tightened the nut. The whole repair took 8 minutes. While I was under there, Patricia stood in the doorway and made small talk that felt like an interrogation. So, Marie, do you remember much about how the business is structured? I mean legally, with the shares and all that. We should probably sort that out soon. David handled all of that, right? She was fishing. I answered with a vague mumble about how David took care of everything corporate and I just handled the daily books. She asked if I'd found any of his personal papers, maybe a will or a trust document, and I said no, just a lot of old tax returns. She looked relieved and said we'd talk about it another time. She didn't notice that I'd hesitated for a microsecond when she mentioned shares. I tightened the compression nut an extra quarter turn just to keep my hands from shaking, and then I climbed out and said the sink was fixed. As I washed my hands, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw a woman who looked fragile but who had just repaired a plumbing line, and I realized the mask I wore was becoming a weapon. That night, I decided to push deeper. I needed to know what Patricia and Richard were hiding in their home office, the room on the second floor of the main house, where I'd seen Patricia disappear for hours with a key around her neck on a beaded lanyard. I waited until 2 a.m, when the main house went dark and the silence was complete except for the hum of the air conditioning. The guest house had a separate entrance through the garage, But I'd observed that Patricia and Richard never locked the connecting door from their laundry room into the guest wing. I'd tested it twice already, opening it just a crack and listening at 3 in the morning. So I slipped through in thick socks, my pick set in my pocket, and I crept up the back staircase to the second-floor home office. The door was locked with a standard Schlage lever set, a 5-pin cylinder with a spool pin on number 3 that I could feel the moment I inserted my hook. I started with a tension wrench in the bottom of the keyway, applying a little counterclockwise torque, just enough to bind the first pin. I heard Uncle Roy's voice. "Light pressure, Marie. You're not arm wrestling it, you're asking it nicely." The first pin set with a clean click. The second was loose, barely binding, so I skipped it and moved to the third. There I felt the classic false set, the core rotating a degree and then stopping, a spongy resistance that told me I was dealing with a spool. I eased off the tension slightly and pushed the pin upward, feeling the counter-rotation in the tension wrench as the spool edge cleared the shear line, then a solid set. I went back to pin 2, set it, then pin 4, pin 5. The lock turned with a soft snick. 15 minutes. My old skills were still sharp. I eased the door open, careful to avoid any creak, and stepped into a room that smelled of leather chair and stale coffee. By the faint glow of a street lamp through the blinds, I could see a large oak desk, a leather executive chair, and a 4-drawer lateral fireproof filing cabinet against the far wall. That cabinet was the prize. I knelt in front of it and immediately recognized the lock as a tubular cam lock, the kind with 7 pins arranged in a circle around the keyway. Tubular locks require a specialized tension tool, and I'd come prepared. Earlier that evening, I'd bent a paperclip into a small circle with a straight tail, forming a makeshift tubular tension tool. For the pick, I used a small half-diamond that could reach each pin individually if I angled it carefully. I inserted the tension tool and applied light rotational pressure, then probed pin 1, feeling the slight give as it bound. I pushed it upward until I heard a soft metallic click, then moved to pin 2, pin 3, around the circle. The hardest part was keeping consistent tension while moving the pick, and twice I lost it and had to start over because I'd let the plug rotate back, releasing the set pins. I paused, breathed, and reset my hands. This was a lock I'd practiced on at my uncle's shop, but that was 20 years ago. Sweat dripped down my back despite the cool air. I worked methodically, listening to the tiny sounds, feeling for the telltale vibration of a pin seating. After 40 minutes that felt like hours, during which I heard the house settle twice and froze both times, all 7 pins were set, and the lock core rotated with a loud snick that seemed to echo forever. I froze for a full minute, waiting for footsteps. Nothing. The second drawer held a hanging file marked Hartford Reorg. Inside, I found the documents that turned my blood cold. A stock sale agreement, 2 pages, dated 6 weeks before David died, allegedly signed by me, selling my 50% ownership of Hartford Storage Corp. to Patricia for the sum of $10,000. My signature was a clumsy forgery, close but wrong in the loop of the M and the slant of the R. I knew my own signature like I knew my own face. For 23 years, I'd signed payroll checks, rental agreements, and tax returns with a deliberate, looping flourish that no one had ever duplicated. This was a photocopy of a tracing, the kind you'd get by holding a real signature up to a window and tracing over it. Beneath it was a notary acknowledgement stamped by Richard, whose notary commission I now realized was the key to their entire scheme. I flipped to the next document, a letter from a bank approving a $300,000 line of credit against the business, dated 3 days before David's heart attack, with a personal guarantee page that also bore my forged signature. They had borrowed $300,000 in my name, secured by a business I supposedly no longer owned, and the loan documents required monthly interest payments that were already past due. The most chilling piece was a draft of a letter to the corporation's registered agent, notifying the state that I had resigned as an officer and director. A yellow sticky note in Patricia's handwriting was attached. File immediately after M signs the release. R will handle the notary backdate. M was me. The release was something they had not yet got me to sign. They needed my living, breathing signature on at least one more document to make their forged timeline stick with the county clerk. Without that final signature, the whole tower of fraud was shaky, and they knew it. I photographed every page with my phone, double-checked that the images were clear, and then returned the file exactly as I had found it, down to the angle of the sticky note. I relocked the cabinet with the same tubular pick in reverse, relocked the office door, and wiped down every surface I might have touched with a microfiber cloth I'd brought for that purpose. I tiptoed back to the guest house, my heart pounding, and slid into bed just as the sky began to turn gray. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, finally understanding the scale of what they were trying to do. They weren't just stealing my business. They were setting me up as the legal scapegoat for debts that would land in my lap the moment their scheme collapsed. 3 days later, the contact I'd been waiting for finally arrived. A man named Alan Crane called from the law firm listed in David's letter and asked to meet me somewhere private, away from the house. I suggested a coffee shop called the Daily Grind in a neighboring town, a place where Patricia and Richard never went because it wasn't trendy enough and the beans weren't single origin. Alan was in his 60s, dressed in a rumpled suit that had seen better decades, and he spoke with the calm precision of a man who had witnessed every variety of family treachery and was no longer surprised by any of it. He slid a folder across the table, and inside was the full picture of David's quiet countermeasure. David, it turned out, had been the quiet architect in more ways than one. 18 months before he died, after Patricia's first attempt to convince him to sell the business at a family dinner, where she'd called our operation, a glorified garage business with no exit strategy, he had gone to First Community Bank of Millbrook and established an irrevocable trust called the Hartford Storage Voting Trust. That trust held 51% of the company's voting shares, with me as the sole beneficiary and trustee upon his death. The trust provisions were so specific they bordered on paranoid. Any transfer of the trust assets required 3 things: my physical presence at that specific bank branch, my signature witnessed by a specific notary named Frank Kowalski, a man David had known from Rotary and trusted implicitly, and a biometric handprint scan that the bank had on file, taken from me years ago during a routine upgrade and stored in their vault. David had set it up after that tense dinner, and he had told no one, not even me, because he knew I would have called it excessive, and he didn't want to burden me with the worry. He was right about almost everything. Alan explained that Patricia had already attempted to access the trust by presenting the forged stock sale agreement at the bank about 10 days after the funeral. She'd walked in with Richard, all confidence and crocodile tears, and told the bank manager that she was now the rightful owner because of the sale. Frank Kowalski, the notary, had immediately flagged it because the notary seal on the document didn't match his logbook, and he had never witnessed my signature on any such document. He'd refused to process the transaction, and the bank's compliance officer, a sharp woman named Alina, had referred the matter to federal authorities. The fraud was already on law enforcement's radar, but to build a prosecutable case, they needed Patricia and Richard to try again, to dig the hole deeper, ideally in a recorded manner that couldn't be explained away as a paperwork error. Alan asked if I was willing to wear a wire and play along until they led me directly into their trap, at which point we would spring David's trap instead. I said yes before he finished the sentence. A federal postal inspector named Marcus, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a very quiet voice, met me at a hotel outside town later that week. He fitted me with a small recording device, a thin wire with a microphone that clipped inside my bra, and a transmitter the size of a matchbox that went into a pocket sewn into the lining of my jacket. We practiced for 3 hours. He coached me on how to keep my voice calm, how to trigger the device by touching my jacket in a certain way if I needed to make sure a particular phrase was captured, and how to act naturally during stressful moments. He said the device had a range of about 50 feet and a battery life of 8 hours, so I didn't need to worry about it dying mid-conversation. I went home that evening feeling like a spy in my own life, the weight of that tiny transmitter a constant reminder that I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a trap inside a trap, and for the first time since David died, I felt something like hope. The maximum cruelty beat came exactly 1 week later. I had been playing the grieving widow for so long I was starting to lose track of where the performance ended and my actual exhaustion began. But I needed one more test. I needed to know, with absolute certainty, that there was nothing left of the sister-in-law I'd known for 2 decades. So I staged a medical emergency. I waited until Patricia and Richard were both home, sitting in the living room with a stack of documents spread on the coffee table. I'd noticed that the stack included a fresh, crisp-looking form that I recognized from the office as a release and indemnity agreement, the very thing the sticky note had mentioned. I walked into the room with a cup of tea, let my hand tremble, and then I dropped the cup. It shattered on the hardwood floor, ceramic shards skittering everywhere, and I collapsed, clutching my chest and gasping. I did my best impression of someone whose time was running out. Wide eyes, panicked breathing, one hand grabbing at my shirt. "Help me," I choked. Call 911. What happened next plays in slow motion in my memory every single time I think about it. Patricia looked at me on the floor, sprawled and gasping. Her gaze flicked to the documents on the coffee table, and then she stepped over my legs. Not beside me, not around me, over me. Her expensive loafer passed inches from my trembling hand. She bent down, picked up the release form and a pen from the edge of the table, and knelt next to my prone body. She pressed the pen into my hand and positioned the paper under it, her fingers cool and dry. "Sign this first," she said, her voice calm and almost annoyed, as if I'd interrupted her gin and tonic. "Then I'll call. Just sign right here, Marie. Right on the dotted line. Then everything is fine." I let my hand go limp. My head lolled to the side, and I made my breathing shallow and ragged, eyes fluttering. Richard stood in the doorway with his phone in his hand, but he didn't dial. He just watched with a detached curiosity, like a man watching a nature documentary where the outcome didn't matter. I heard Patricia hiss, "Now she's useless. We'll try again when she comes to." Then she set the pen down, stood up, and I heard her footsteps leave the room. The pen rolled off the paper and clicked against a shard of ceramic. I lay on that floor for 10 more minutes before I let myself stir, and in that time I felt the last drop of family loyalty evaporate into the air-conditioned silence of their designer living room. The wire had caught it all, every word, the sound of the shattered cup, the rustle of the document, even the soft click of Patricia's loafer on the hardwood as she stepped over me. That audio file would later be played in a courtroom, and it was almost impossible to listen to without feeling a chill. The confrontation came sooner than I expected because the bank's patience had run out. The $300,000 loan was officially in default, and the bank had sent a demand letter to the business address. Patricia intercepted it, and the next morning she burst into the guest house with false cheer and a plan dressed up as a favor. "Marie, we need to go to the bank and sort out some paperwork David left unfinished. It's just a few signatures, a formality really, and then we can put all this behind us. I've already scheduled an appointment. I'll drive." Her smile was stretched too wide, and her eyes checked my face for resistance. She didn't know that Alan Crane had already scheduled his own appointment at the same bank, with Frank Kowalski behind the desk, and a federal postal inspector seated in the lobby pretending to read a brochure about certificates of deposit. She didn't know that the wire I'd been wearing since dawn was tucked into my jacket lining, or that every word she'd said since, "Sign this first," was already in an evidence file. She just thought she was finally going to get my signature on the release that would complete the theft of my business. We arrived at First Community Bank at 10 o'clock sharp. Richard drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and Patricia chattered about how nice it would be to have everything sorted. I sat in the back seat, clutching the edge of the envelope where I'd put the original stock certificates, and I said nothing. The bank was a red brick building with a clock tower, the kind of place where they still greet you by name. Frank Kowalski greeted us in the lobby with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been a notary for 35 years and had seen every flavor of scam try to walk through his door. He was a small, balding man with half-moon glasses and a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the room. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartman, Mr. and Mrs. Palmer," he said, using my name correctly, which made Patricia flinch. He showed us into a small conference room with a table, 4 chairs, and a security camera in the corner that I knew was recording. The walls were thick, the air still, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Patricia spread her documents across the polished wood surface with the proud efficiency of a realtor closing a deal. "All you need to do," she said, "is sign here, here, and here. It authorizes the transfer of the business's operating control to me so I can clean up the mess David left. It's exactly what he would have wanted, Marie. He told me once he was worried about you being overwhelmed." She uncapped a pen, a fancy metal one with a smooth click, and held it out to me. I looked at the document. The release language was a masterpiece of legal destruction. It would have signed away my rights to contest the stock transfer, ratified the forgery as legitimate, and indemnified Patricia against any future claims. I folded my hands in my lap and said the words I'd been rehearsing in front of the bathroom mirror for 3 days. "You can't steal what was never yours." Patricia's smile flickered. "What?" I repeated it, slowly, deliberately, letting each word land like a stone dropped into still water. "You can't steal what was never yours, and David made sure you never had a chance." I nodded toward Frank, who opened the conference room door. Alan Crane walked in first, his rumpled suit looking particularly purposeful. Behind him was the postal inspector, Marcus, in a plain gray jacket, who flipped open a badge and identified himself as a federal agent. 2 uniformed police officers followed, their belts creaking. Patricia's face cycled through confusion, to fear, to pure fury. Richard tried to scoop the documents back into his folio, but Frank Kowalski's hand came down on them first with a finality that made Richard flinch like a child caught shoplifting. "I'll take those, sir," Frank said, and his voice had the weight of an oak door closing. The inspector read Patricia her rights in a flat, practiced tone. The charges included conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery, and attempted theft by deception. Richard was charged as an accomplice, and Frank made a phone call to the state notary division that would revoke Richard's notary commission before the hour was out. The forged documents were seized into evidence bags with numbered seals. I produced the original share certificates from the lockbox, and Alan carefully placed them into a bank safe deposit box with a chain of custody form that he witnessed and signed. Patricia screamed as they led her out in handcuffs, her composed mask finally shattering into something ugly. She called me every name she could think of, some of them so inventive that even the police officers raised their eyebrows. I stood at that conference table, still holding the pen she had offered me, thinking that the only sound I could hear was the quiet click of David's trap finally snapping shut. The pen was heavy and cold in my hand, and I set it down on the table, perfectly parallel to the edge, before I walked out into the morning sun. The aftermath took 18 months to fully unfold, and I learned more about the legal system than I ever wanted to know. Patricia's attorney tried every delay tactic in the book, filing motions to suppress the wire recording, claiming illegal search and seizure of the shredded documents, arguing that the trust was improperly established. None of it stuck. The wire recording of her stepping over my body and demanding I sign before she called 911 was devastating to any defense. The federal prosecutor, a woman about my age named Susan, played that tape at a pretrial hearing, and the room went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom, and when the tape ended, Patricia's own lawyer looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Patricia accepted a plea deal that included 5 years in federal prison, restitution of the $300,000 loan principal plus interest, and a permanent bar from ever acting as a corporate officer or notary again. Richard got 2 years, reduced slightly because he cooperated once he realized Patricia was going to throw him under the bus, and he flipped, providing additional evidence about her earlier forgeries. Their house on the hill was seized to satisfy part of the restitution. The leased cars were repossessed, and I heard through the grapevine that they now live in a 1-bedroom apartment in a town 3 states away, where nobody knows their names and nobody cares what they used to drive. The civil case was where David's foresight truly paid off. Because the trust owned the controlling interest in Hartford Storage, and because Patricia's forged transfer was void from the very beginning, the court declared that I was the sole legal owner of the entire company. The $300,000 fraudulent loan was discharged in cooperation with the federal investigation, and the bank actually sent me a letter of apology printed on heavy stationery with the president's signature, which I framed and hung in the new office. I worked with Alan to restructure the company's finances into something more durable than they had ever been. We paid off every legitimate business debt, switched to a cash-only reinvestment model so we'd never be leveraged again, and I brought in an independent auditor who reviewed every contract and certified the business's financial health in a public report that went to all our long-term tenants. I renamed the business Nova Storage because the old name felt like it belonged to a chapter I needed to close. The rebranding ceremony was small, just me and a new sign and a few loyal employees who had stuck with me through the chaos. The new sign was blue and silver, with a simple star logo that felt fresh and hopeful. I planted a dogwood tree near the front gate in David's memory, I used the first year's profits to establish a scholarship fund called the David Hartman Promise Scholarship. Every year, that fund pays full tuition for 2 first-generation college women who are studying business or a skilled trade, because David believed in screwdrivers and degree programs in equal measure. The first 2 recipients were a young woman training to be an electrician, who reminded me so much of myself at that age, and another heading into accounting, who could read a balance sheet like a poem. At the award ceremony, I told them about the man who could fix anything with a socket wrench and who never raised his voice, and I watched their faces as the story landed. I saw hope and determination there, and I felt David's presence in that room as surely as if he'd been standing behind me. There is a plaque on the wall of the main office now. It reads, "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching, except the dead man who already knew." It's a bit long for a plaque, but I like it. And there is a line item in my budget for security. His name is Mickey, a former Marine who served 2 tours and now prefers a quiet life. He gets paid a full-time wage to sit in a guard shack at the front gate, and his instructions are simple. If Patricia Hartman ever sets foot on Nova Storage property, he is authorized to physically escort her off the premises. He gets an extra $100 hazard pay each time. I almost hope she tries. Almost. The best revenge isn't shouting or lawsuits or even prison sentences, though those all help. The best revenge is a gate that never opens for your enemy and a scholarship fund named after the man who outsmarted her from the grave. David spent his whole life fixing things with his hands, and even after he was gone, he fixed this. He just needed me to be patient and to remember the combination. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If this story resonated with you, hit like and subscribe for more true tales of family, betrayal, and the quiet weapons we leave behind. Until next time, guard your assets and your heart.